Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Musical Mornings with Rock Island Sound and the Westchester Children's Museum. My name is Rachel, for those of you who haven't seen me before, and I am a voice, guitar, and piano instructor with Rock Island Sound. And I have been here doing these live streams talking about the history of popular music. So, if you were with us last week, you knew we talked about the Beatles and the 60s. And there were some other artists that I wanted to mention, but the Beatles are just so influential that I figured it would be best to focus more on the Beatles. And so now we're moving into the 1970s, and that was a very interesting time for popular music. The state and climate of the country, the United States, was, not the best, going through a lot of different civil rights movements and wars and various things that were making the overall climate of the country generally a little bit rough. But whenever things are happening in the real world that are troubling and problematic, we have music to fall back on, to rely on when we need a helping hand, when we need support, when we need to just let our emotions out. And that's been the case for years and years now. Music has been the medium to which we all feel our emotions, learn about ourselves, and have favorite artists and songs that get us through hard times. And that's been going on since music began. So when we're talking about the 1970s, right? So the Beatles split up in 1970. Pretty sad day. But then there were a bunch of other artists that got their beginnings right as the 70s began. And that's what I want to talk about today. So the first artist who was super important, super influential, you may have heard of him before, is Elton John. Sir Elton John to be to be precise. And he is an English singer, songwriter, pianist, and composer. And he's actually released over 30 albums. And on all of them, he collaborated with the lyricist Bernie Taupin. And so he worked on the melodies. Elton John worked on the melodies and the musical arrangements. And Bernie Taupin worked on the lyrics and the content of this song. He has sold so many albums, over 33 million copies of different songs worldwide, such as Candle in the Wind. And he's produced his own records, he's acted in movies. He was raised in the greater London area, and he learned to play piano at a very young age. And he and Bernie Taupin met after they both answered each other's ads for songwriters and melody musicians. So they worked together for a couple of years before they got their real start, before they started taking off. And he released his first album, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which was totally different from anything that the world had heard before. And it was also different because people weren't really sure what his deal was. They couldn't really tell if he was a typical masculine man or if he had some other attributes that would have made him more feminine. But people didn't really care, even though this was still a relatively taboo time to be anything other than the norm. People were just fascinated by his work, his lyrics, the stories that he and Bernie Taupin would tell through their songs. And that was really the first the when that first album dropped, that was the cultural reset, if you will, changing the sound of music in this different decade. So let's take a little listen to his song Tiny Dancer, which is a really, really beautiful one. So as you can probably hear there, the piano is very detailed and extensive, and that was and still is his strong suit, his way of speaking. Some people say that they speak another language through singing or through playing the guitar, and the piano is Elton's way of taking us on a journey. And he learned the piano at a young age and just kept going with it, kept practicing, and got to a level of real proficiency, and was at a level that really did make him stand out. The way he was able to play the piano and sing at the same time is a very impressive feat. And it's just one of the coolest things to see is when somebody is so passionate about their instrument and then they're singing along with the song that is equally as beautiful and interesting and coming from a place of such passion. So if you don't know Elton John, I really recommend taking a listen. His career spanned over, 7 decades at this point. He's still going. He's still doing amazing things, working for various foundations and charities, always spreading his wealth. And recently there was a movie made about him that came out last year called Rocket Man, which is a play on another one of his most famous songs. So if you really want to learn more, the movie was fantastic. But moving on to another very prolific artist born in the same year as Elton John, 1947, was equally as quirky and different and innovative and influential and against the norm, and that would be David Bowie, originally known as David Jones, but that's not a super good stage name, right? David Bowie sounds a lot better. So he's considered one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, like all of the artists we really are talking about on these streams. And he's, acclaimed particularly for his innovative work during the 1970s. And his career was sort of marked by constant reinvention. And so, what I mean by that is that with every new album, every new song that David Bowie would release, it was almost as if he was playing a different character and he had a completely different sound that he was going with and a completely different character that he was representing. So, he did a lot of reinventing, visual presentation, and in his music videos and his different tours, his music and the way that that translated on stage with stagecraft and theater it was such a big impact on popular music because people didn't really know that they could be that campy and theatrical in pop music. But David Bowie gave them the chance and the freedom to try that out. So he's sold over 100 million records worldwide, making him one of the best-selling artists. And he also grew up in the UK, just like Elton John. Um, Also around London, different areas, but both around London. And he developed, his interest in music as a child. Then he began studying art and music and design before he embarked on his full-blown career. And the really interesting thing that he did in 1972 during the glam rock era, which was an era of a bunch of punk rockers that were simultaneously wearing a lot of makeup and wearing fancy clothes and being very flamboyant. And he created an alter ego named Ziggy Stardust. And Ziggy Stardust won him a lot of widespread popularity because nobody had ever seen such a fully formed alter ego before. And this album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, was so different from anything other people had heard before. And they really, really, really enjoyed it. And then what's the most interesting to me is that then David Bowie spent a lot of time in Berlin, Germany. And I spent a lot of time in Berlin, Germany, because I went there for a study abroad program last year. And learning about how he created and formed his albums that he wrote there, which was 3 different albums that he wrote there, really interesting because at that time in Germany, electronic bands and electronically driven artists were really getting their start, and they were trying a bunch of new experimental things that were completely different from the normal popular music. In this On the side of Western Germany, in Dusseldorf and Cologne, there was a few different groups. Um, Depeche Mode is the most well known, but there are some more that you might know. Kraftwerk was the most iconic electronic German band, as well as Tangerine Dream, and many, many more. But David Bowie took a lot of inspiration from these Western German electronic bands, particularly the bands Neu, which means new, and Can. They were really, really interesting for him. And so when he released his album Low, that was the beginning of his Berlin and Germany inspired. Berlin is on the east side of Germany, but that's where he lived when he was there. But he was getting a lot of inspiration from the bands that started on the other side of the country. So when he released Low, which was the first album that was confounded with all of this electronic music, he was actually also collaborating with prolific producer Brian Eno, who is best known for his work in pioneering ambient music and pop electronica. So together, Brian Eno and David Bowie created some of David's best projects, particularly the second one, the middle one that he created in Germany, called Heroes. And Heroes is one of his most iconic songs, but the entire album was fully conceptual and sounded like it was German. It was obviously spoken and sang in English, but the inspiration and the influence that he had taken from these different German bands was very clear. Maybe not super clear to the average American, but if you've studied those German bands like I have, it's a really interesting and beautiful thing to see how he experimented with his musical styles and wasn't afraid to try new things that were popular in Germany, but he didn't know if they were going to translate or be popular in America. But they did, of course, because he's David Bowie. So, but let's listen to his first big song, the one that really took him from normalcy to popularity back in 1969, 1970. Space Oddity. And it's a really beautiful, emotional, kind of depressing song about an astronaut lost in space, floating around. And Bowie spent a lot of his career focused on this idea of space, and that's sort of how Ziggy Stardust came to be a few years later. A star man, somebody who lived in the stars and with the planets peacefully. So for our last couple of minutes, I want to mention a completely different artist, entirely different genre, but the exact same era, who is incredibly important, and that is Aretha Franklin. She was singer, songwriter, pianist, and a civil rights activist, and she began her career singing gospel at church in Detroit, Michigan, where she grew up. And when she turned 18, she left the house and she embarked on a secular music career, which means not related to the church, not related to gospel, as a recording artist for Columbia. But at the beginning, her music didn't immediately flourish or take off. But people have theorized that that's because the people she was working with at Columbia didn't really understand her. And if anyone knows Aretha Franklin, they knew that she had a specific idea of how she wanted her music to go. And she was very smart. She knew everything about arranging music and everything about producing the music that she wrote. So when people wouldn't listen to her, and they thought that they knew better, it was no surprise that her music at the beginning didn't do as well as it could have because it wasn't as authentic to her as it could have been, as she wanted it to be. But then, a few years later, in 1966, she got signed to Atlantic Records instead, and that's when she started to find commercial success. And so, as the 70s began, she had already become known as the Queen of soul music, and she continued successfully throughout the 70s and 80s and jumped around with the different record labels that she was signed to, but an absolute icon. I was lucky enough to see her before she passed away a few years ago, and it was extremely special because she was such a pioneer. She was one of the first Black women to be so famous and so renowned, and it's extremely inspirational, and we can all learn something from that. And she never gave up despite all of the hardships that she had to have gone through as a Black woman in the industry. If you want to learn more about Aretha Franklin, I highly suggest it. She has so many beautiful songs, and we didn't even scratch the surface of her life and her history. Um, she was absolutely just iconic, and she was, inspired by different artists that we've talked about before, like Billie Holiday. She took a lot of inspiration from Billie Holiday, and if you pay attention to the big figures in music, both female and male identifying, you see the clear line of inspiration that's drawn from different artists, and it's really interesting and beautiful to see. So that's going to be all for today. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed. My name is Rachel. I'm with Rock Island Sound. You can sign up for some of my virtual camps, FaceTime, Zoom, Google, and I am doing virtual lessons this summer. So if you want to learn a new instrument or how to sing while staying safe from our own homes, then you can sign up through Rock Island Sound with lessons for me. Make sure to tune in on Monday when Andrew tells us all about the violin again and different things that we can do with the violin. And if you're interested in continuing on with my music history journey, I'll be back on Tuesday morning to talk about the 1980s. So I hope that you all enjoyed. Have a wonderful 4th of July. Listen to some music and yeah, bye everyone.